Welcome to Crimeaholics, a podcast that touches on crimes solved and crimes that remain a mystery. We're your hosts, Jack Maybe,
Charlotte Carswell,
Peter Simon,
and Evan Bauer. In today's episode, we will be talking about the unsolved murder of Pamela Werner, a young woman living in Peking, China in the late 1930s. Thursday, January 7th, 1937 was Pamela's last day alive. This day was normal until her disappearance. This morning, Werner went to a dentist appointment, then returned home to write letters. Then she left her home in the afternoon because she had plans to go ice skating with her friend Ethel Gurevich. When her servant asked if she had wanted a snack, she declined, saying that she was leaving but would be home by 7:30 for dinner. When Ethel and Pamela arrived at the ice skating rink, they met a third friend, Lillian Marinovsky. After skating for around an hour and a half, Pamela told her friends that she had to go home for dinner. Her friends asked if she was okay to go home alone at night, and she said that she always travels by herself and that nothing can happen to me here in Peking. Lillian watched Pamela ride away on her bicycle. This was the last time Pamela was seen alive.
At dawn the next morning, rickshaw pullers found Pamela's body in a ditch along the walls of the Fox Tower. There was no blood on her clothes or anywhere around where her body was, which indicated that she was killed somewhere else other than where she was found. Her body was mutilated and her heart had been carved out of her body and her face was mutilated.
This story was adapted into a New York Times bestselling novel by Paul French titled Midnight in Peking. This book not only covers the murder, but also covers the investigation that followed.
The key investigators into this murder were DCI Dennis, the chief of the British Municipal Police, and Colonel Han Shi-chung, lead of the local police.
This investigation had three main suspects: Sidney Yates, Sun Tae-sing, and Wentworth Prentice. Sidney Yates was the headmaster of the school that Pamela attended, Tianjin Grammar School. He was not known as a very kind man. He was known for his excessive discipline on students. He was asked to leave his school in another place in China for being too aggressive. He studied in England and then went to Africa to teach and then left for Tianjin Grammar School. There were allegations of inappropriate behavior with Yates with his students, including Pamela. Pamela's father, Edward Werner, threatened to expose him, but no one wanted a public scandal, so Yates left with his family. He was, however, in China at the time of the murder, which made him a prime suspect. However, his family never returned, and nothing else was said about him in the book.
Our next suspect is a Canadian foreigner named Pinfold, who was suspected because in his room there was blood found, and at first, when police questioned him, he didn't talk, but eventually he told the police that he was working for the third suspect, Wentworth Prentice, at a nudist colony kind of party. I don't know exactly. It was for a weekend pay, and because of that, he became one of Prentice's buddies, and that's why he's part of the case.
Our third suspect is Wentworth Prentice, who was Pamela's dentist, but had been under suspicions because of the ways he treated girls in the brothel.
And when Wentworth was brought in for questioning with the police, he denied ever having seen Pamela as a patient. Mm-hmm. But later on in the novel, it was revealed that Pamela was his patient by another Russian girl that was also one of his patients.
There was also a letter that he wrote to Werner about a year later talking about Pamela. And so from there, it was basically figured out that he basically knew who Pamela was and was trying to get to her. And that's eventually what led up to her murder, in a way.
There were many times where he invited his young patients to come to his house, which is very odd.
True. Yep.
Another suspect in this case was a rickshaw puller found nearby where Pamela's body was found. He was washing blood out of his cushions. But later, whenever he was questioned by police, he said that the blood belonged to a Marine, which was in a fight on the street that was in his rickshaw. So,
after 20 days of the investigation going on and not much information being found, and the media had already gotten a hold of it and started falsifying it, so they kind of started to give up on it.
And once the police gave up on it, then Pamela's father was forced to take matters into his own hands and started an investigation on his own.
Which is kind of ironic, just because initially Edward Werner, Pamela's father, was actually one of the suspects in the investigation.
Yeah.
A lot of people thought he could have murdered Pamela since he had anger issues.
Mhm.
Yeah, because they'd been seen fighting a few days before. They fought a lot, and that's what their neighbors
Yes.
noticed.
Yeah,
So
and Pamela had, I think it was either like a friend or a boyfriend that Warner had gotten mad at, and he had lashed out at him and ended up getting a bruise, I think, on his head. And Pamela felt sorry for him, so they went out to dinner. And then that's when Pamela met up with her friend to go ice skating.
yes. After Edward Werner had decided to take the investigation into his own hands, he met up with the original suspect, Soon Tae-sing, the rickshaw puller, and Soon told him a completely different story than what he had heard from the police, and that was that one night he was sitting outside of a brothel in the Badlands in China, and he said that he was waiting for passengers and that two men had brought out a woman who was like almost unconscious, and they had gotten her into the carriage in the rickshaw, and that she had her face covered with a cloth, but she was wearing clothing similar to that they found on Pamela's body, and they had asked him to drop them off somewhere, and that he wasn't supposed to ask any questions. They kind of just he dropped them off, and I think he was waiting for a tip, but then one of them got out a knife and said that if he didn't leave, then bad things would happen. So he left.
Yeah.
The place they came from, the brothel they came from, and if you don't know what a brothel is, it's basically like a place where prostitutes go and they get
Make
paid.
money.
Make money basically. And so number 28 was this, that place. It was a brothel, and that was where Prentice would usually hang out with his buddies, and they'd pretend they were having a party, which is what they did with Warner, and then they'd drag him into this, pretty dirty looking room, I guess, and basically try to have an affair with them. And they weren't forced to say anything because the people that they were having an affair with were like of high standing, so they couldn't really say anything against these people because they were basically not someone who was well known in the community of Peking or the Badlands, I guess. And that's where number 28 was, I believe, right?
Yeah.
It was in
It was
a place called the Badlands, which is basically kind of like the slum area of Peking.
Yes. An outside article about the Badlands said that it was where a lot of returning military soldiers came for entertainment.
So there were a lot of brothels in the Badlands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And besides number 28, there was number 27, which I believe was a Russian dive bar, which is where Pinfold and Prentice also hung out. And since we're on the topics of places, we should probably talk about where Pamela actually lived and her father, which was Armor Factory Alley. And that was basically where Pamela lived her whole life when her father, her, and, her late mother, who had died due to drug overdose, they moved from Britain over to Peking. Or it was originally Warner, and then he met his wife Gladys Nina, that's her name, and I think they adopted.
Yeah, they
Pamela?
adopted.
They
Pamela.
adopted Pamela.
Mm-hmm.
So they lived in Armor Factory Alley, and then when Gladys Nina passed away, Pamela was given $20,000, and from that she bought a watch that was supposed to basically help remind her of her mother.
Mm-hmm. And they had neighbors, Helen and Edgar Snow. And something else that was interesting in the book was that after Pamela's murder, Helen Snow went to the police and Pamela's father and basically thought that people were after her. So since Pamela and Helen looked similar, Helen thought that they were after her, trying to kill her, but accidentally killed Pamela instead. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was interesting.
Later in the book, Helen revealed that she wasn't quite sure that was really the case, though.
Yeah. So that was kind of a dead end.
And by what was called the Tartar Wall was the Fox Tower where Pamela's body was actually found. And there's a lot of rumors and stuff that was circulating about fox spirits and it was a whole like cultural thing surrounding that tower.
And there was a story very well known by a lot of the locals in China around the Fox Tower, and that was that the fox spirits could take human form if they had like a lot of interaction with humans, but if they didn't, then they'd return to their fox appearance. And there was a story about a man who went there and met with a friend a lot, and who turned out to be one of the fox spirits.
And
But then figured out that
he wasn't his friend.
yeah, that he
Okay,
was just a spirit.
yeah. Yeah, and so it's also said that they usually appear at night, and so because they're trying to look for people to, satisfy themselves, I guess? You usually just have to kind of sneak past, which is what the rickshaw pullers did, as you see at the start of the book. They were ducking over, trying to not be seen, and just trying to get through the night.
And then at the end of the book, the author of the novel, Paul French, actually like brought up what he thinks happened in the murder.
Yes, he believed that Prentice had been with one of his hunting friends in a brothel, and they mutilated Pamela there and drained her blood and organs down the sink, and then went and threw her down by the Fox Tower, which is why nobody saw her blood or organs anywhere in Peking.
The important thing to point out about French's theory is that he got a lot of his sources from Edward Werner, who started investigating after the investigation had occurred, just because he obviously was upset that the investigation on his daughter's like death just ended without any form of like closure at all.
And that's why some of the information could be biased, because since the author actually like based all of his knowledge off of only the father, then I heard that he made a lot of like allegations.
Yes.
Just because he was like really looking for who killed his daughter, obviously because he's her father, and he was a lot more motivated to find the killer than the police were.
Yeah, that's definitely one thing that's really hard to point out in this book. Any bias, because it all sounds factual, and well, most of it probably is. Warner might be like emotionally biased due to what happened to his daughter, so the claims he's making might tamper with the actual like what happened.
Yeah, and I remember in the beginning of the book, the police didn't want him to get involved, because that's like how crime is today. They don't want anybody in like the family or their friends getting involved, because with them like knowing them personally, it can interfere with a lot of things.
So another thing about the book is that the police were seeming to not do much about the case, and eventually over time the case was kind of forgotten about. But one important thing that was uncovered as the story progressed, Pamela's clothes were actually never taken in for fingerprint evidence, and well, before they could even get to the main suspect's fingerprints, who had been on her clothes, it had been contaminated due to too many people touching it. And also, the blood that was on her clothes never had been washed, even when they had been returned back to Werner. And
she also had her skating rink card with her, and it was at the scene of the murder, but the police never did much with it.
Yeah. And I think that they could have solved the murder a lot better if they could have tested, which was kind of suspicious, because the police, like, it sounded from the book like Dennis was actually trying to solve it, but especially whenever the Soon Tae-sing, the rickshaw puller, actually revealed the real story, he said that he actually told Colonel Han that that's what happened, but Han made up the story about the Marine. So someone was hiding something.
Yeah.
The police definitely could have done a lot better to help with the case. It seemed like they probably had a more important case to deal with. The book didn't really touch on that. It just said that they were bad, so that might be putting the police in a bad light. But we really don't know what exactly was going on with the police, other than they just didn't really.
The author of the book was more able to make up a
story
guess of what happened.
Yeah, than the real people involved were. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we can like partially attribute that just to like the setting and like kind of like Jack said, there's probably there might have been like a bigger case going on they were focusing on. It's just a case like this was probably a really low priority case because there wasn't a lot of evidence and it wasn't someone of like great value to them, I guess.
Yeah, you just reminded me. So the book does talk about how there are many, I think it says British girls who are murdered in Peking. It talks about, like, I think maybe just girls in general or white Russians.
Yeah, all the foreigners.
Yeah.
Wait, oh yeah, that's right, because they suspected that Pamela was a white Russian girl, and that was who, like, majority of who was being murdered in Peking was these white Russians. And I guess there's reason to believe that might be from number 28, but...
And I remember that the DCI dentist was actually, like, trying, like, you were kind of in his head, like, in the book. He was actually trying to solve the murder, and then you had the people in England, where he was from, telling him to come back because his 20 days were up, but he didn't want to because he wanted to solve it, but there just wasn't enough evidence for him to solve it. So I think that he was really the only one that was actually trying, and I think it was actually said that they suspected that Colonel Han was actually being paid off by the owners of the brothel to not say anything.
Yeah, and even though, like, the case was being glossed over, when Werner was trying to gain evidence, it seemed like everyone he was trying to get to kind of shut him out. Like, I don't remember his name, but he got angry at people who talked to him, and he went to his house, and he started talking to him about the case, and he told a boy to turn him away. I can't remember his name, but I just know he would get aggressive with people he would talk to.
Because he was really motivated to obviously solve the murder of his daughter, so unlike anybody else.
I mean, I guess that, like, aggression and not violence, but just, like, very aggressive attitude towards it could have, like, interfered with, like, his investigation. It's, like, maybe if, like, he took a more, like, calm and, like, relaxed and more thought-out approach to it, maybe he could have, like, actually gotten some, like solid evidence and, like, more concrete results.
Yeah, I believe that too.
And another thing that showed that Werner was really dedicated to solving the case was that the Chinese police offered 10,000 Chinese silver dollars as a reward for whoever came in with any, like, tips or found who murdered her, which is actually 10 times what the average Chinese family lived on per year. So that was a lot of money already, but Werner actually pretty much doubled that and offered his, like, entire life savings for anybody that had any tips on anything.
And Werner was a well-known figure in Peking, so this probably reached far and wide, as did the case. And they were pretty rich, so they lived in a rich part of Peking.
And yeah, I think it's crazy because Peking was, like, a gated, like, community, and everybody thought that it was, like, a protected place, which is why Pamela thought that she would be fine, like, riding alone at night, how all of her friends were like, oh, are you sure you'll be okay? But it was said to be, like, protected because all the foreigners lived there.
Yeah, and even her father allowed her to just roam around by herself.
Yeah, at night.
And they trusted, Werner trusted her to come back at the, like, she had a curfew, as, you know, any, like, teenager would, so she was expected, on the night she was murdered, to come back, but when she didn't come back home at the time that Werner suspected she would, he started getting suspicious. And so he set out, and because Pamela never had really gone to the Badlands, I guess he never tried searching around that area. And it was only till he got to the Fox Tower where he found Pamela's body. And it was probably perfect timing because he had probably already walked by it once, but that was before the rickshaw puller had gotten near the tower. And so it just happened to be perfect timing.
Because it said that it was pretty late whenever he picked them up.
Yeah, so he must have been there at an earlier time. And, actually no, didn't he go back home? I think he might have gone back home and then the next morning he went.
I think so.
Yeah, are you talking about Werner?
Yeah.
Yeah, Werner, I think he, like, went out and looking for her, and so did, like, the servants and stuff, but then he went back home and said, oh, she might come home later, I'm just gonna go to bed, and then he woke up and
he woke up.
she wasn't there. And then he actually didn't find the body until the police had gotten there and everybody was already surrounding it. Whenever he came in, he was yelling, like, because he knew it was her, because she was missing, so.
Yeah.
If it hasn't been obvious already, the story's, like, very hard to follow. So, like, events that, you could understand while reading the book sometimes may not, like, immediately pop into your head.
Yeah.
So, we're following the main events, but there's many other things that Paul French touches on in the book that you can read yourself and, get the whole story.
Yeah.
And it's hard to decipher like which events are more major and relevant just because of how little we know about this case. And I think we can attribute that to the lack of time spent on the investigation, just because it's not like a very prevalent case. Like, if you look online, you probably won't find too many things about this case or like too many conclusions that people have reached.
Yeah, and I think that follows along with how the author based it all off of her father's thoughts. So I'm sure his thoughts were all over
Right,
the place.
'cause
He was just looking for
Probably
anything
the
he could
best
find.
source he could find.
Yeah,
Yeah.
his father was probably just looking for any suspects or
Yeah.
anything suspicious that he could find.
Any bit of information that would help.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes for the characters as well. There's many characters introduced in the book that 50% of are basically irrelevant. And as with the case, if you search them up, there's barely really anything about them. They're just kind of pieces to the puzzle.
Yes.
And they get lost in the story.
And then touching back on like the community of like Peking, I think that Peking, it was also like protected because a lot of the historical things that were happening at the time, all the Japanese like invasions and everything, all the foreigners were protected from them. So that's why it was thought to be a safe place. But the Japanese obviously weren't the only threat because
I think because Peking was such a safe place, that could have been like one of the things that like made rumors spread like more rampantly, just because it would like because it was probably like unthought of for it to like get this bad for like several different foreigners to be disappearing and dying in a place thought to be like so safe.
And especially with how badly her body was like mutilated, that was probably one of the first times that had happened for them.
It's a funny form of irony, but it happened.
So since all of this was taking place like during a war between China and Japan, in 1943, the Japanese removed all of the foreign European residents from the legation quarter, and including Prentice and Werner. Since Prentice was never arrested or anything, Werner just suspected him of killing her. They were moved to the Weisenhen entertainment camp in Shandong, where they spent the remainder of the war. According to other survivors of this camp, Werner a lot of the times like confronted Prentice about the murder, but he never said anything about it.
Yeah, it's pretty sad that all of the suspects got off easy and just continued moving on with their lives. And they didn't have any punishments.
Yeah, because no one ever like came to a complete conclusion.
Yeah.
So.
And it might be because Peking was seen as such a safe place that they possibly didn't have as strict policies as you'd see in other places. So that might be part of the reason why they were let off so easily, even though it was new territory for them, and they had been, captured, put in the camps.
Yeah, because there's nothing that Japanese are going to do about it afterwards, obviously, because if they're in a camp, like...
Japanese don't care about the case.
Yeah. And after the war was over, Werner returned to his home in Peking, and this was obviously almost 10 years after Pamela's body was found, after the murder first started, after the case first started. But even then, he still resumed to press the British officials about the case, saying that it wasn't over, and he sent them letters and everything, but they ignored him. And then 2 years later, he finally went to England, or went back to England, where he died in 1954.
Yeah, and that just shows the dedication he had for his daughter, even after her death. Just that he didn't forget about her and still was trying to fight for her, even though the case seemed to be a lost cause. He thought of her every waking hour and just continued to solve
trying
the case.
To figure out any more information that could lead to.
It's a little sad to like think about it now because like realistically, this case is probably never going to be solved just because
Yeah.
like we don't have like the same connections that he would have back then to be able to actually find out what happened.
Yeah.
So
And since it took because an online source that I read said that the only other thing that was ever said about Pamela was in Werner's obituary, just basically saying that he had a daughter who passed away before him, and since then nothing has been said, nothing has been published on any credible source about her murder until this book. So that shows that there's probably not anything that's going to happen with it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the suspects are all dead now.
Yeah, so it wouldn't really matter anyway.
Yeah. I think the fact that it was never solved was because, like, that's part of the reason why there's so little sources about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the murder had been solved, the case would probably be bigger than it was back in.
Yeah, and it would have a lot more publicity.
Mm-hmm. But still, having a British girl murdered in old China, that was still pretty big. You know.
The book said that did happen very often, though.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were a lot of cases
and there was
this that we don't know about.
Yeah, and it said there was a lot of like gossip about just about, not even about the murder, just about her and her father, like even before she was killed, like they were pretty known members of the community.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And like we said before, since the press got hold of it, they started twisting it a lot, which kind of made the police lose hope about ever finding anything because nobody would know what to believe.
The press were given hardly any information, if any, and they were just trying to get a story out to the people. And so it might have been big just because of how the press worded it, and then after the fact, that's when it started to become small and less relevant.
Yeah, because obviously over a month had passed and it still hadn't been solved, so I'm sure other crimes happened before and after that, and people were just like, oh yeah, that one girl that was killed never, they never found
it's kind of sad
who it was. Like I remember sometimes the press, like I think they said that I don't remember the name of, but the Chinese like dogs, like the wolves and stuff, they like mutilated her body even though that wasn't true. They said that someone like left her out for the dogs.
Another thing is just historically speaking, the world, especially China, was in a very chaotic state. So that could be another reason why the entire case was just kind of lost to the winds of time. Just there's a lot of conflict going on throughout the world, and like in China, like there was a whole world war going on, like only a few years after this case. So
and I feel like everyone in the community was kind of on edge, like about either like the murderers or the Japanese invading and all this stuff. Even though,
I think it can definitely be said that because of everything that happened after Pamela's death, that's what took Peking out of its, I guess you could say, glory days, out of its like peaceful state, and it just became something much worse.
Yeah, and it got the reputation it has.
Yeah, so I think that the Prentice, like the whole theory about Prentice and them killing them, obviously, since it was proven that she was unconscious and they took her to a sketchy location with the rickshaw puller, I think that was pretty accurate. I think that was a good thing, even though it was never proven.
I also believe that happened. It kind of matches up with the lies that Prentice told. And then
about never knowing who she was and all this stuff. Yeah. I'm glad that that Russian girl came along to tell them the truth, that she was one of his patients, and she like told Werner like what kind of a person Prentice was and about all the things that he did.
Yeah, he made them feel guilty about what he did to them.
Yeah.
Everything seems to lead back to Prentice.
Yeah.
Based on what's happened in the book.
And he knew with his name he had in the community that the media would believe him over the less.
Yeah, and Prentice was known to like women, so it definitely would also add up more to him being the suspect due to how he, seemingly dragged women into number 28 and into that bedroom. It's just very, inhumane. And
Yeah.
I think it's a very plausible theory. Again, we obviously have no concrete evidence to support it.
Mhm.
But I think that that's definitely something that could have happened. I can't
Yeah.
be too sure though.
Yeah, and I remember when I was reading the book, I was thinking that it was the headmaster, the Sydney Yates guy. I was like, oh, like there was nothing that was ever said about him, and he like fled the country basically right after she was killed, so that's kind of suspicious. But then whenever I read about the Prentice thing, I was like, oh, yeah, that's probably
That
right.
sounds pretty accurate.
Sounds
And
a lot more relevant.
Yeah, and I think that if the police would have actually known known what really happened with the rickshaw puller and everything, if Han hadn't covered it up, then I think they would have done
More
better.
investigations.
Yeah,
on
done
that.
more investigation on Prentice instead of just dropping it and being like, oh, there's no evidence. We're just gonna drop it.
That's a wrap on this episode of Crimeaholic. We hope you enjoyed listening and look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Until then, I'm Jack.
I'm Evan.
I'm Charlotte.
I'm Peter.
We'll see you next time.